Prostitution was one of the major ways women earned money in 19th century Melbourne, Australia. Let's dive into this scene. Prostitution is often lumped together with crime and slums in the historical imagination, but it wasn't illegal in Gold Rush Victoria. A century ago, Melbourne was Australia's most populous city, with over 500,000 people. Ships traveled the world and docked in Melbourne. Hotels were bustling, grocers and lamp factories worked well into the 20th century. Chinese Australians used Chinese numerals on their homes, including their buildings in the Little Lon district. Buddhism has no view on monogamy and advocates for the middle of the road in all issues, avoiding extremes. So tolerance of prostitution occurred then and now among Chinese Buddhist populations. 6% of the Australian populace today is Australian Chinese. Most of Little Lon's original residents were Irish, but by the 1900s the area was home to people from Syria, China, Germany, India, and Italy. The 1900s Sands and McDougall directory listing from the precinct includes cabinet makers. Families as large as 9 and 10 dwelled in small two-room workers' cottages, many of which were standing as late as the 1950s. Entrepreneurs started their own businesses. Others eked out a living as best they could as hawkers, factory hands, laundry workers, and shop assistants. No white privilege was present. Little Lon had always been a working-class neighborhood of Melbourne, but an influx of poor and single women who were permitted rentals meant it soon gained a reputation for a different reason, as the leading red light district of the city. An 1883 Royal Commission into the state of the police force lamented the decline of public morals. There is scarcely a suburb or a street in the city free from open and undisguised prostitution. Those disreputable houses are the recognized haunts of the vicious and criminal classes, for whose accommodation they are made accessible at all hours of the day and night. Along with the brothels, termed disorderly houses or houses of ill fame, came newspaper reports of opium smoking, with the opium shipped from China or India, which you can learn about in the Sassoon video on this channel, petty criminal activity, stabbing, gambling houses, and violent crime. In 1889, the Herald reported that police were being called nightly to some terrible dens where they found attached to these disreputable establishments large numbers of men and hoodlums, constituting a most dangerous element and responsible for the robberies and violent assaults on defenseless wayfarers. Presiding over the scenes of debauchery was the infamous Caroline Hodgson, aka Madame Brussels, who opened her first brothel in the precinct in 1874. She went on to run brothels in the area for 30 years and made many high-flying friends. In the 1880s, Melbourne's Christians moved in, determined to clean up Little Lon and rescue its inhabitants. The Church of England's mission to the streets and lanes set up shop at number 30 Little Lonsdale Street, and St. Vincent de Paul operated a home next door. In 1891, Sister Mary MacKillop established a slum mission in Latrobe Street, and from 1897 the Salvos ran a women's shelter named Hope Hall. These buildings were incredibly important due to the high rate of abandoned children and many children who were left homeless after the activity in the brothels. Little Lon's unsavory reputation was all but cemented when rising poet C.J. Dennis burst onto the literary scene in 1915 with his best-selling verse novel, The Songs of a Sentimental Bloke. Dennis riffed, What's in a name? What's in a string of words? They scraps in old Verona with their swords, and never give a bloke a stray dog's chance, and that's romance. But when they deal it out with bricks and boots, in Little Lon they're low, degraded brutes. Dennis' songs and his follow-up verses, The Moods of Ginger Mick, which you can still buy today, enshrined the scowlin' slums of Little Lon in popular culture, with his lead character Bill, aka the sentimental bloke, spending his leisure time gettin' on the shick, and his nights down there in Little Lon with Ginger Mick. In the ensuing years, the campaign to clean up Little Lon gathered pace until Victoria's Police Chief Commissioner, General Blamey, was forced to act, vowing to wipe out the Little Lonsdale Street menace. In April 1932, the Truth newspaper reported that the biggest vice raid in the history of Melbourne had been carried out in the colony of doubtful sisterhood, known as Little Lonsdale Street. 32 arrests were made of white slaves, which is what trafficked women were called up until the 1950s, at the time reflecting the worldwide slave trade in white women which goes on today, resulting in a mannequin parade for the night staff at the watch house, dainty lace petticoats and silk stockings crowding the counter, while their owners feverishly struggled with paint and powder. The women were charged with vagrancy, but most escaped prosecution by demonstrating that they had money in the bank and didn't need to solicit anyone. Melbourne's city bylaws were subsequently amended to close loopholes, much to the delight of the city's newspapers, suburbs, and missionaries. Little Lonsdale Street is doomed, the Truth newspaper reported. The days of the street of evil are numbered. In 1948, the Commonwealth government acquired the blocks that made up Little Lon. The northern block was razed in the ensuing decades and replaced by a giant Commonwealth government building. Locals branded it the Green Latrine in a not-so-subtle dig at its phosphorescent green cladding. Many did not know that the building housed latrines from brothels decades before. Australian neighbours in the respectable suburbs of Melbourne complained if women danced in the streets or appeared without a bonnet or showed their petticoats, as public decency laws were enforced, so the police tried to confine prostitutes to particular areas. These women must live somewhere, the police said in the superintendent's 1874 report, and that somewhere was the eastern Little Lon district in Melbourne's northeast corner, where the dressed girls were kitted out and lived in the flash brothels under the supervision of madams. The less expensive streetwalkers took their customers to the short-time houses and timber cottages in the narrow back lanes. Perhaps the most famous inhabitant was Madame Brussels and her Bellevue villa, still commemorated today with a bar of the same name on Burke Street. You can sit in the same places her women did, attracting men from the streets below. Clientele came from everywhere and every class, but proximity to the all-male enclave of Parliament and Treasury was a distinct advantage for fancy brothels. Despite being legal, women had to keep quiet or risk arrest and imprisonment under laws against disorderly behavior and vagrancy for prostitution. Prostitution depended and depends on a steady flow of liquor and drugs, as archaeological digs revealed before the buildup of Melbourne in the 1980s. The area has been extensively excavated by a series of archaeological projects over the last 30 years, and recent intensive research on the artifacts recovered, held at Museum Victoria and Heritage Victoria, reveals much more about the brothels and the women who owned them that had disappeared from memory. Madame Brussels, or Caroline Hodgson, was born in Potsdam, Prussia, a daughter of John and Frederica Lohmann, or Lomar. She married the well-connected Studholme George Hodgson of the Hodgson military family in London in February 1871 when she was 20 or so and her husband was 36. The couple immediately migrated to Australia, arriving in Melbourne on the ship Melmerby in June 1871. In November 1872, Studholme joined the Victoria Police and was placed in Country Mansfield, leaving his 25-year-old wife alone in Melbourne. Perhaps Caroline used her husband's military and police contacts to traffic women from around Australia, the Pacific, and Europe to Australia. Hodgson had brothers in India who would have come into contact with impoverished women looking to work the streets. By the end of 1874, Caroline, using the name Madame Brussels, perhaps to indicate her international reach, was running a number of brothels, an occupation she continued until 1907. When her husband became ill with tuberculosis in late 1892, Hodgson arranged for him to be nursed at Narwin, a property she owned on Beaconsfield Parade, St. Kilda. You can learn more about tuberculosis in the pandemics video on this channel. He died in 1893. Memorial notices she placed as his loving wife Caroline Hodgson made mention that he was brother-in-law of the Baronet Sir Francis Wood, the brother of Sir Evelyn Wood, Field Marshal in the British Army. So we see this similarity of the nobility indulging in extreme vice, just as the Cleveland Street scandal revealed, which you can learn about on this channel. In 1895, Hodgson married German engineer Jacob Paul, who was at least 15 years her junior. However, Paul suddenly disappeared to South Africa while they were on a trip to visit relatives in Germany in 1896. They reconciled in 1898, but a divorce was granted in February 1907 on the grounds of desertion. In court, she appeared as a most benevolent-looking old lady, and quite secured the sympathy of the court by her demeanor and recital of the story of her wrongs. She was reportedly well-spoken and did not use foul language. Hodgson died the following year at her Lonsdale Street home, suffering from diabetes, blindness, and chronic pancreatitis. She was buried at St. Kilda Cemetery in the Roman Catholic section beside her first husband. She was survived by an adopted daughter, Irene, whom she forbade from joining the sex trade, giving away how violent and terrible it was. Hodgson's establishment of brothels in the Little Lon district suggests she received financial backing from friends in high places, a charge also made by Melbourne's Truth newspaper during their long campaign against her. Hodgson's principal establishment, which was also her home, was located at 3234 Lonsdale Street, not far from Parliament House and relatively easy to shut down if the authorities had wanted to. The building was extravagantly furnished and catered to Victoria's commercial, political, and judicial ruling class, acting much as a gentleman's club. In the late 19th century, Hodgson became the target of increasing vilification from newspapers and public figures. In his 1891 pamphlet, The War Between Heaven and Hell, religious crusader Henry Varley singled out Hodgson for particular scorn, describing her as an accursed procuress who was protected by the city's magistrates, including her husband. In one famous passage, he claimed she toured the streets of Melbourne in charge of a beautiful young girl under 20, with a white feather in her hat, telling by advertisement, the white feather, that maiden virtue was to be had for a price in her gilded den. Hodgson is also associated with the disappearance of the Victorian parliamentary mace in 1892. Rumors suggest politicians took the valuable object to one of her brothels, where members used it for unparliamentary activities. Another theory has the mace disappearing at a brothel owned by her chief rival, Annie Wilson. John Norton's Truth newspaper also regularly attacked her, reporting in detail any of her court appearances. In March 1906, Truth ran the headline, "Madame Brussels' Notorious Bawdy House, Her Junketing Jezebels," above drawings of her flash girls. A wealthy grazier had called the police after his watch and sovereign purse were stolen in the brothel. Later that year, in a major expose, the paper detailed Sir Samuel Gillett's many years of financial dealings with Hodgson. As Leanne Robinson notes, although Gillett freely acknowledged his role as Caroline's mortgagee, he claimed ignorance as to the nature of her business, despite the fact that, as a parliamentarian, he was instrumental in framing legislation against gambling and licensing, and chaired public meetings on the suppression of vice where he would have heard evidence, including Madame Brussels. Within a week of the report, Lord Mayor Gillett resigned and soon after returned to England. Hodgson had lost a significant ally. In April 1907, after appearing in court charged under new laws with owning and operating a disorderly house, the ailing Hodgson closed her brothels in Little Lon. With failing eyesight and diabetes, she continued to live at her Lonsdale Street property until her death in July 1908. Her building was demolished to make way for a factory as of 1914. But the stench of Little Lon remained, and the Australian government got involved. The factories were demolished to make way for the Commonwealth Building in the 1990s. Several buildings that still remain that were contemporary with Madame Brussels. These include the former Black Eagle Hotel and Spa, built 1854 at number 4244 Lonsdale Street, and the Workers' Cottage at number 17 Castleton Place, built 1877. Hodgson's former seaside property in St. Kilda still stands, where her first husband died. A city laneway has been named after her, and of course she graces the Melbourne bar that bears her name. The brothel owned by one Mrs. Bond on Lonsdale Street, in comparison, was so quiet that no one knew it was there until archaeologists dug up her backyard in 1988. The excavators speculated that the site had been a brothel. Alicia Bond arrived in Little Lon from Ireland as a widow, but with a de facto husband suffering from tuberculosis, which you can learn about in the pandemic video on this channel, just like Madame Brussels' husband. In 1862, Bond had 3 young children to support, and when her son attacked her husband, she reported at the trial that she could not see her children starve. She had first taken in washing, she said to the court, and then had to keep a brothel to support the family, since washing didn't pay all the bills and selling her body was way more lucrative. She started by renting a back lane cottage for a brothel and eventually bought her own house on the main street and opened a grocery shop. She then poured her earnings into real estate, buying cottages which she rented out to other prostitutes, keeping control over her little community. The cover was very effective, and the only reason we know about her brothel is because the artifacts recovered include evidence of brothels. This includes a large number of bottles of champagne, 77 of them, imported spirits, 4 of them, and absinthe, 10 of them, amongst the rubbish in her backyard, along with over 300 oyster shells, which were a popular dish in brothels. Such luxury items were typical of the higher class brothels and could not be purchased by Little Lon residents. The selection of dinner services and drinking glasses projected middle class status in order to create a familiar environment and attracted a wealthier clientele than the back lane cottages. Mrs. Bond's brothel was not as popular as Madame Brussels, but it had at least 8 rooms and a prominent Lonsdale Street frontage. Around the corner and down a side street, Mary Williams rented two very basic, detached two-room cottages from Mrs. Bond. Rubbish discarded in her cesspit indicates a very different class of brothel. No imported champagne or absinthe bottles could be found. Only beer or wine bottles, 90 of them, two gin schnapps bottles, as gin was and is produced domestically in Australia, one cognac bottle, and 165 oyster shells. Mary Williams came from Ireland via a brief marriage in Adelaide, but in 1870, when she was still in her 20s, she left South Australia with George Williams and found herself in Little Lon. Within months, her husband was in prison for theft, and in 1872, Mary was described by a policeman as a drunkard, running one of the most disorderly houses in the lane. She had two babies while she was there, but both died in infancy. Mary Williams' brothel attracted less well-to-do clients than Mrs. Bond's and Madame Brussels, but prostitution provided her with more money than domestic service or factory work. However, abandoned children from brothels remained a problem, and children's homes were frequently overwhelmed with the number of children abandoned by their parents. Prostitution in the Little Lon district was fraught with dangers, including venereal disease, death, and violence, but some scholars consider it a feminist achievement. Women worked on their own, with friends, or in brothels run by madams, not by men. There was a community of support around the women, often including relatives and the publicans, pawnbrokers, grocers, and dressmakers they patronized. Both sides of the coin are evident in the story of Mary Murray, who rented one of Mrs. Bond's cottages. She died after being badly beaten by a client, but beforehand a friend took her to the hospital. The women relied on each other, and there are many other stories of support. For example, when Mary Williams went into labor, she was attended by a neighbor who had some skill. For some women in this area, prostitution was cited as their method of survival. For others, it was a way of life that offered income and independence, and women actively chose it over other careers. Wages for domestic work available to women with children was low and lower for girls. In 1878, two young women earned 12 shillings a week, or about $20 at the time, as domestic servants. They told a policeman their wages wouldn't keep them in boots, and they earned more from street work on their nights off. After her husband's death, Mrs. Bond raised her three sons on the proceeds of her brothel. At the same time, she poured her earnings into property, living, and running her grocery/brothel in one house and renting others to prostitutes like Mary Williams and Mary Murray. When Mrs. Bond died, her property portfolio was the envy of many. Evidence gathered from this small area of inner-city Melbourne indicates women were far more active in the property market than has been previously recognized. Married women found ways to overcome common law restrictions to land ownership, and widows and daughters worked their way around the attention of estate trustees. Land ownership was often disguised by the conventional use of male relatives' names in the records. The unexpectedly high rate of women's property ownership in 19th century Melbourne highlights the colony of Victoria's early adoption of property rights. The area of relative independence for female prostitutes was not to last. Respectability was important to Melbourne, and the Church and Salvation Army saw prostitution as a moral issue as they were overburdened with abandoned and starving children. Soliciting in the streets was criminalized in 1891, and the Police Offenses Act of 1907 made it illegal for landlords and madams to profit from prostitution. It also addressed what to do with repeat offenders, something that frequently goes ignored by courts today. This act effectively put the flash brothels out of business and sent Victoria into an era of protection rackets, with women working under the surveillance and control of men instead of madams. However, Melbourne remains a hotbed of prostitution and has a mile-long red light district that has been linked to sex trafficking worldwide. There are women today in Australia dedicated to this topic, including Sarah Hayes at La Trobe University and Barbara Minchinton, who has published multiple books on the subject.